Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. I keep up with the news, and most of my listeners are very much politically informed. We've all heard the headlines this week. President Trump in North Korea. President Trump speaks at CPAC. The surge of illegal immigrants at the border. The Democrats in the House taking up a new investigation into the president's dealings. The purpose of this program is to sometimes give biblical commentary in the news, but mostly to step back and to hear from God. Straight up biblical teaching. Now, obviously, the Bible doesn't follow all the latest trends. Bible gives us overarching, timeless truths upon which we're to renew our minds. So, for the last two programs, I've taken up this subject. How does God reestablish his authority on earth whenever it's challenged? And this is such a dominant theme in the Bible. If you've missed it, you really don't know the Bible very well. Genesis begins with a rebellion against God. Revelation ends with God reestablishing his authority on earth and redeeming a people for himself. And throughout the Bible, we see God having to step into human history time and time again to reestablish his authority. And this is a type or foreshadowing of the coming great day of God. This is such a large topic to discuss here that I need to take it up again in today's program. Last week I concluded with this principle that God has to supernaturally bring deliverance for his people. It's not as if we can or we should defeat entrenched evil in this world. God is the one who's the judge. As in the case of Noah and the flood and the Tower of Babel and Sodom and Gomorrah and the 10 plagues in Egypt, the conquest of Canaan, the destruction of the Assyrians under King Hezekiah. God's people don't save the day. God has to do it for us. And the ultimate supernatural deliverance of God is the cross itself. At the cross of Christ, God legally defeated Satan. And at the second coming of Christ, he is going to bring the physical victory. All done supernaturally by the hand of God. A few verses in this regard. Psalm 57:2. I will cry to God Most High, to God who accomplishes all things for me. Psalm 138:8. The Lord will accomplish what concerns me. Isaiah 59:16. And God saw that there was no man, and he was astonished that there was no one to intercede. Then his own arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness upheld him. God had to do the saving. Man was not able. Isaiah 26:12. Lord, you will establish peace for us, since you have performed for us all of our works. Isaiah chapters 24 through 26 are called the Apocalypse of Isaiah, where Isaiah gives a partial pre-New Testament description of the events in the book of the Revelation. And the text concludes with this principle that God has to supernaturally save his people from this ungodly world, just like in the book of the Revelation. Isaiah 26:18, we could not accomplish deliverance for the earth. So verse 21, for behold, the Lord is about to come out of his place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. So it's not as if the church has to bring down the coming empire of the Antichrist, prophesied in the book of the Revelation. It's not as if we have to defeat the Antichrist by our political activism or even by our evangelism. There's a Christian video game out there based on the Left Behind series, and this video game is called Tribulation Forces. Subtitle, the first game where worship is more powerful than guns. The promo reads, Left Behind, Tribulation Forces is a real-time strategy game based on the best-selling Left Behind book series created by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. Join the ultimate fight of good versus evil commanding tribulation forces, the global community peacekeepers, the all-new American militia, combat the Antichrist forces on two battlefronts, physical and spiritual warfare, use the power of prayer and worship to resist spiritual influences and defend against their physical attacks, control more than 40 unit types, each developed with unique attributes and special abilities, and witness angelic appearances and demonic battles as a direct result of your choices. Command your forces through the streets of New York in one of the most realistic recreations ever seen in a video game. I'm not going to pick on this video game, but this is just a great example of how Christians are not supposed to think about the apocalypse. In fact, I am picking on this video game. I would never expose children to the spiritual worldview espoused by this video. In Revelation chapter 18, the evil world system is defeated. And in verse 20, rejoice over her, O heavens, and you saints and apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. God does the saving. Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. He is the judge. He is the jury. He's the executioner. This exclusive deliverance by God is such an important truth that Christians need to learn, especially in our day as we see the culture being taken over by secular leftists. I mean, Christians have been working very hard over the last century to hold back Antichrist ideology, and this is what we should do. But there comes a point where we need to understand and find comfort and encouragement in the scriptural teaching that when evil takes over, God has to step in and rescue his people supernaturally, apart from anything we can do. Deuteronomy 32:36. He will have compassion on his people when he sees that their strength is gone. And this is counterintuitive for many of us, because we tend to focus on texts such as Philippians chapter 2, verse 12, work out your own salvation. Remember Jesus' words in Matthew 21:21. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what has been done to this fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. It's always been my persuasion that if you really believe in the will of God, that a certain mountain needs to be cast into the sea, maybe you need an island to build a Christian college on, then God would have you pick up a shovel and start digging. Or maybe God would have you raise money so you can buy a fleet of backhoes and start moving the mountain. I'm all about believing that faith means our action. But we also have to be humble enough to admit what we can do and what we cannot do. We have to be honest enough in evaluating our abilities, our calling, and evaluating the enemy before us. And there comes a time when we need to hear the words of Moses at the Red Sea. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. Exodus 14:13. And here is Charleston Heston at the Red Sea, just as a reminder. At that point, there was nothing the Israelites could do. They couldn't defeat the power of the Egyptian army. If any Israelite at that time would have suggested building a bridge across the Red Sea, or building rafts, or plotting some sort of negotiations with the Egyptians, that Israelite would have been quite naive, not understanding the hopelessness of the situation. Even as some evangelicals today underestimate the ungodliness in the American majority. The Jewish people in Moses' day, they were realists. They all said to Moses, we're going to die. But God intervened with a miracle. He didn't intend for his people to fight that battle. So also at the end of this age. As we look at our culture today, the ungodly secularists, the cultural Marxists, have taken over the public schools, the entertainment industry, the government, the businesses. The persecution of Christians is already beginning. And it's just a matter of time before they reach their goal of fundamentally remaking America into Sodom. I could do a whole program about this. Maybe I should entitle it, Humanly Speaking, the Left Has Us Beat. And that's going to be revealed over the next decade. I can hear the objections. Pastor Brad, well, we might be able to win back the House in 2020. We may be able to pack the courts with conservative judges. Maybe the cultural Marxism on college campuses will go out of style. Maybe the LGBTQ movement has plateaued. I mean, there have been other times in America where all seemed lost, but God's people got busy. I understand these things. The point I'm making might be ahead of the time. We may get some temporary relief, but I'm giving you heads up that the biblical teaching concerning the end of this age is that evil takes over and God has to defeat it supernaturally. It's not that we defeat the evil, but God miraculously saves us. He defeats the evil for us. We're to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. God is the one who overthrows the spirit of this age, the Antichrist world order. Case in point, the Tower of Babel, Genesis chapter 11, just a few centuries after the great flood, verse 1. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. And it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. They said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city, and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." What's interesting about this text is the unanimous consent on the part of these ancient people that this would actually be a good idea. A centralized, one-world government, rather than having competing factions, like probably in the pre-flood world, there would just be one state. Now, if there was a true follower of God at this time who understood human depravity, who understood God's command to mankind to fill the earth, who understood that power corrupts, and that absolute power corrupts absolutely, what could he do? Not a whole lot if the people wouldn't listen. The spirit of the age was to have centralized control. So God steps in and supernaturally confuses the language and scatters the people. Genesis 11:6, the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people. They have all the same language." And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That must have been quite a day, when all of a sudden the people all around them started to speak gibberish. The arrogant social leaders of Babel were faced with the supernatural hand of God. God thwarted their objectives, and there was nothing they could do about it. They were soundly defeated. The followers of the one true God at this time, they may have only been a handful, but on their behalf, God completely destroyed the spirit of the age. God reestablishes authority. As in the Song of Moses, Exodus chapter 15, terror and dread fall upon them. By the greatness of your arm, they are motionless as stone. So having considered the example of God's work at the Tower of Babel, where do we see Babel mentioned in the New Testament? Well, the kingdom of the Antichrist is described in the book of the Revelation as Babel resurrected. Revelation 17:5, on her forehead a name was written, a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abomination of the earth. Revelation 18:2, and he cried out with a mighty voice, saying, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit. Why is the end of this age described as Babel? Because the world once again unites to create an anti-God, humanistic, global, totalitarian state. And how is this future Babylon the Great defeated? Well, the same way it was defeated in Genesis chapter 11. A supernatural, unexpected intervention by God. And the enemies of God will be soundly scattered and defeated by social upheaval and cosmic judgments, and the authority of God will be reestablished. Now, in this regard, some Christian thinkers have taken from the example of Babel a model for how the Christian right can overturn cultural Marxism, that we need to confuse the language of the left. How do we do this? By pointing out the inconsistencies and the irrationality of intersectional leftist political theory, or by letting the competing philosophies of cultural Marxism battle each other. Well, like in the case of Gideon, where the enemies of Israel turned upon each other. The Midianites began to fight the Amalekites, and all Israel had to do was stand by and watch. So today we are to let the feminists fight the transgenders, who fight the open border crowd, who fight the racist identity politics crowd. Well, that gets all very heady and deep, but I don't believe that that's the point of the Tower of Babel. The point is not to teach us what we must do, as if we must philosophically confuse the languages of the left. The lesson from the Tower of Babel is what God does supernaturally on our behalf to stop the spirit of the age. C.S. Lewis understood God's lesson embodied in the Tower of Babel probably more than most 20th century theologians. Lewis's third novel in his space trilogy, That Hideous Strength, the conclusion of a celebrated space trilogy which begins in Out of the Silent Planet and continues in Perelandra. This novel is all about British intellectuals associated with the university who are inspired by demonic ideology and demonic forces to bring about a global antichrist totalitarian state in Europe. The organization they found is called the NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments. And I never realized until recently that this title, That Hideous Strength, came from a Scottish poem in the 16th century about the Tower of Babel. The poem speaks of being in the shadow of that hideous strength, living under the shadow of the Tower of Babel, not just the tower itself, but living in that ungodly cultural ideology within that city. And Lewis correctly associates British socialism with the ideology of Babel. And in Lewis's novel, how do you think Lewis has the NICE and these college intellectuals defeated? Well, the college is having a banquet at Belbury. And the director is giving a speech, but suddenly he uses words that nobody understands. The people for a while ignore the strange vocabulary, but soon everyone is speaking gibberish. The objectives of these leftists are thwarted by a magical confusing of the language. And then Lewis has lions and bears and elephants bust into the room and devour all of the participants. Now, Lewis wrote this novel back in 1945. George Orwell, the anti-communist who wrote against Big Brother in his novel, 1984, didn't have nice things to say about Lewis and his novel, That Hideous Strength. Quote from Orwell: "One could recommend this book, That Hideous Strength, unreservedly, if Mr. Lewis had succeeded in keeping it on a single level. Unfortunately, the supernatural keeps breaking in, and it does so in a rather confusing and undisciplined way. What was Orwell's complaint? Which I think is very informative. Well, Orwell didn't believe that the totalitarian state could be or would be overturned by the supernatural, because Orwell was a practicing agnostic. He believed the solution to societal's ills needed to be man-centered. There was no God to step into history to save the day. Sounds familiar? There are leaders on the political right who only speak of human solutions, and there are even leaders in the evangelical world who only speak in terms of what the church must do. A complete supernatural intervention is not even considered. So Lewis responds to these negative reviews of his novel, quote, "Apparently reviewers will not tolerate a mixture of the realistic with the supernatural, which is a pity because A, it's just the mixture I like, and B, we have to put up with it in real life." So this was C.S. Lewis's Christian worldview, and here Lewis clearly saw the overall biblical message. Aslan, the type of Christ, has to supernaturally defeat the White Witch. Peter, Susan, Lucy, and Edmund could not do it. There has to be a supernatural solution to the culture war. Now, in literature, this is called Deus ex machina. It's a device in a story where an unsolved problem is solved in an unexpected, magical way. So much so that it seems contrived or out of place. Many critics hate this. They hate when the supernatural or the providential come in and save the hero of the story. For example, in The Lord of the Rings, Saruman has Gandalf trapped in the top of a tower. But a gigantic eagle arrives and carries Gandalf off to safety. Or in Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones and his girl are tied up, they're defeated, they're helpless, but the Ark is opened, and the Death Angel arrives and kills all the Nazis, and Indiana Jones is freed. And often in novels, the solution to the protagonist's dilemma comes from some unseen hand of providence. Now, this is all fiction, but it is a reflection of a biblical redemption story. Salvation comes from outside the main character, outside of his ability to save the day. So George Orwell, he has this complaint against C.S. Lewis's solution to the spirit of the age. But the irony of this is that in George Orwell's own novel, 1984, Orwell offers no solution to how to defeat Big Brother. In fact, at the end of Orwell's novel, the main character, Winston, finally is brainwashed into accepting the power of Big Brother, and the final sentence in the novel is, he loved Big Brother. Which reminds me that mankind, apart from God, even if he has some resistance to the Antichrist spirit of the age, has no way to defeat it. It can only be done through God. Noah could not convert the pre-flood world. Eber in the godly line could not stop the Tower of Babel. Abraham could not reverse the LGBTQ agenda in Sodom. The Israelites in Egypt could not defeat the power of the Pharaoh. But God steps in and saves his people supernaturally. Zechariah chapter 4, verse 6. This is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, saying, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. Now, how exactly does God do this? How does God defeat his enemy and reestablish his authority in this world? Well, the obvious answer is death. Death is the great equalizer. God sent the flood to destroy every living thing. God sent the death angel to kill the firstborn in all of Egypt. God sent his death angel to kill 185,000 Assyrians camped outside of Jerusalem. But in this, God sometimes uses secondary means. 4 of these means are pointed out in Ezekiel chapter 14. Let's just go through this. Ezekiel 14:13. Son of man, if a country sins against me by committing unfaithfulness, and I stretch out my hand against it to destroy its supply of bread, sending famine. Verse 15, if I were to cause wild beasts to pass through the land and they depopulate it. Verse 17, or if I should bring a sword on that country, warfare. Verse 19, or if I should send a plague against that country. And then in verse 21, for thus saith the Lord God, how much more when I send my 4 severe judgments against Jerusalem, sword, famine, wild beast, and plague to cut off man and beast from it. So the ungodly boast in their sin and arrogance. They say to themselves, I'll never be moved. And then they're taken down by war, by disease, by economic collapse, by natural disasters, flood, earthquakes, AIDS, cancers, even natural old age and death. The lives of people are like an hourglass that's running down. God keeps the unsaved world in check. Job 38:11. And I said, thus far you shall come, but no farther. And here your proud waves stop. Now, in addition to physical judgments, God can also stop the wicked by striking them with fear, so they have no will to fight. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 25. This day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the people everywhere under the heavens, who when they hear the report of you, will tremble and be in anguish because of you. Remember 2 Kings chapter 7, for the Lord had caused the army of the Arameans to hear a sound of chariots and the sound of horses, even the sound of a great army. So they said to one another, behold, the king of Israel has hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of the Egyptians to come upon us. Therefore they arose and they fled in the twilight, and they left their tents and their horses and their donkeys, even the camp just as it was, and they fled for their life. This is Proverbs 28. The wicked flee when no one is pursuing, but the righteous are as bold as lions. So rather than the ungodly having the natural motivation to work and to be disciplined, God can snatch that all away from them. Rather than being emboldened to run for political office or to start a political movement, at any time, God can make them so fragile and so insecure that they're paralyzed. And God has probably kept millions of evil people from ever coming to prominence in this world. God has only allowed for a few Stalins and Hitlers. So there are times God judges by disempowering the wicked, and there are also times when God judges by actually empowering the wicked. Not so that they're going to win, but so that they have the power to do what they want to do, so that their judgment will be self-inflicted. This is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where God allows a strong delusion to come upon the wicked, so they follow the Antichrist, so that they will be judged. Now, as we look at the book of the Revelation and the end of this age, the means that God uses to reestablish his authority is a combination of every example we have seen in the past. Fear, providence, evil leaders, famine, war, plagues, cosmic events, all to judge the world. And God thoroughly defeats his enemies and he saves his people. Again, Revelation chapter 18, verse 20. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and you apostles and prophets, because God has pronounced judgment for you against her. And this is the great fear of the wicked. They imagine that they have God's people beat, that they have marginalized those who are on God's side. They imagine they've been able to fulfill their dream in Psalm chapter 2 of breaking God's fetters and casting his cords away from them. They imagine they've been able to get rid of the righteousness and the accountability that they hate. And they boast in the end. As it says in Revelation, who is like the beast? and who is able to wage war against the beast. But God steps in and supernaturally destroys their objectives because you can't beat God. So be encouraged. Salvation is of the Lord. He will save his people. Just make sure you're on God's side, that you have received Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Thank you for taking the time to make God and country a part of your discipleship in the Word. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button on your screen to give some moral support to the cause. If all goes as planned, the topic for next week's program is going to be how to survive the apocalypse. And of course, I'm not going to discuss what most people would assume. So until next week, 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13, fix your hope completely on the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ.